Now I would love to welcome on stage Tony from Teclead, and he's giving us a presentation on how to enable web developers on to work with React in AEM.
Thank you.
Let's welcome Tony on stage.
So welcome, everybody. My name is Tony. I'm part of a company called Teclead. We do a lot of different technologies when we do projects, but we also do AEM development. We're based here in Berlin as well as in Frankfurt. And when we do AEM development, we do it a little differently most of the time. Today, I want to show you a project we worked on since the last 2.5 years. It's an enterprise company based in Germany with multiple brands in the insurance sector. And at first, I want to show you how this project situation is for that client, what challenges we had to face there, what kind of solution we implemented to solve that challenge. And then at the end, I will also show you what we learned and what we're currently working on, because the architecture and technologies we're using here is now not deprecated, but we're doing a little bit more now in new projects, which is even far more advanced, I think, and will help a lot of developers to work in AEM. So let's start. So the project situation for that company is we have distributed teams all around Germany, as well as some people in Poland. There are freelancers through whole Europe. Also, there are people outside of the EU. So therefore, we have a language barrier, different know-how regarding AEM. We had only a high-level architecture provided there, so the target architecture basically said, hey, you have to use AEM inside of that company, and all the other teams which are not building AEM components needs to build everything in React, because they have a lot of different products and services which we are developed in React. Everything was a single-page application and super decoupled from AEM, so there was no real integration there. Like you saw before, you had multiple location and teams. And one special thing, there's also the company had inside of their own organization multiple brands and different designs, different target groups, and everybody was working on the same AEM instance, and every brand had were reusing the same components but in a totally different design and style and experience. And one special thing as well is there was an internal frontend library based on React. What does this mean? So you have on the left side here, there's the brand library. It's an npm module, and the module contains like a list of a lot of plain front-end components which are reused in all these product applications here. So every product, it was around 20 or 30, something like that, was developed by an independent team. And this team used that library as a dependency to include, for example, buttons, call to action components, different modules like complex tables and all kinds of front-end components which were reused in all kinds of products. And then everything was integrated just very simple in the basic AEM template. So there was a link to the JavaScript of the React application, an empty div as a placeholder for the app, and that was it. So what is the challenge here? The challenge comes when business has new things to do. So here at the top corner, you see some things we had to do in a very, very short time. So there was a relaunch happening because all these brands had their own independent business department, but now everything was merged together. We had to redesign every brand, and everything happened on the same AEM instance again. So then also, remember, different teams working on different single-page application products. Also here, new products were developed while the relaunch was happening. And as always, there's a new AEM migration coming up, so please do that as well. And then for the teams, you already saw them. They were spread through whole Europe. There was really no AEM know-how for the internal teams. There were some freelancers as well, but in general, there was only, like I would say 10 teams. 8 of them were pure React developers, so only front-end development, and the rest of them were some mixed teams with Spring Boot applications as well, but the AEM team was just consist of maybe 2 or 3 people. And this was super critical for that project. We had also tight deadline because everything was done super late. And because this front-end library I told you already was based on React, and it wasn't able for the front-end, for the AEM teams to use that for all the AEM components, right? So there was a lot of redundant front-end code because what they did is previously they got the markup from the rendered React components, restructured that so that it works insightly. So you had your normal HDL template, and then again they re-implemented all the JavaScript logic and reused just the CSS classes and the markup. And one big problem here as well, maybe you have that also seen in other companies, the internal acceptance for this target architecture was not really there. So all those SPA teams, they wanted to use their modern Create React app NPM modules and work independently and don't have to deal with AEM. And like basically this part here and this was super critical for the project. And yeah, we thought about what solutions do we have to work with that. So because we had no time and budget to teach everybody in this distributed team structure to say, hey, you could work with AEM, this is how you do it, there are sightly templates, this is OHDI, this is how that works. There was no real time and budget for that. So we thought, what's a technical solution we can provide to enable all these developers to create new React components inside of AEM? And therefore, we use the AEM Generator. The AEM Generator will be explained in some slides ahead, but let's go to the rest of the solutions. Then we also implemented architecture concept, which we call decoupled React components, which just means we have React components which are loosely inside of AEM. They can be reused on the same page multiple times, and they are super independent. And some things, how data will be fetched, is different there. Then we have SEO support for everything by server-side rendering component, which Alex will tell you later how that works. For very complex requirements from the side of the content authors and business, we also implemented a way to use custom dialogues with React. So whenever there are the need for doing very complex authoring logic, we enabled them to do that also within their technology they wanted to use. And then at the end, there's a boilerplate. The boilerplate is just like a basic, lean, fresh project, AEM project with all the toolings you see here on the solution slide. And what that enables them as a company is they have a super wide range for developers to recruit now, because you will see it later how it works, but in general, this is a crucial part of every project. Like, developers are super rare. AEM developers are basically even more rare. And now you can use plain front-end React developers to create all that AEM components. So the boilerplate was structured like that. Just to give you a quick overlook how it was. So you had a front-end folder. Inside of that, you could choose your technologies you want to use. So you could choose React components to create your apps, but you could also use just TypeScript. This was also used, for example, to implement all the tracking logic, because there, for that we also created an NPM module, which was used in every team. And every team was just using our tracking API. This has a super big benefit that if you change something in the tracking logic, you just change it in the module, and every team has it implemented already. So then there are style sheets, storybook. This is also important. I will show that on the next slide. Java end-to-end test. We did that with Selenium, and the end-to-end test we're running on test content, which was deployable. So whenever we had a new component, it was included here in the test content. There was a different page for every component and every configuration. And now we were able to do automated tests on that, but also when you develop a new component deployed to different instances, the content authors are now able to directly see how the components can be configured. And everything, like you see on the bottom, was built with Gradle. So let's come back to the storybook. What is that and why is it helpful for developers? That's basically a storybook. So it's an application where you include all your React components, and then on the left side, you have a list of all available components. It goes way farther down than that. You can also search for that, and then you can look how these components are implemented. And here on the bottom, you also see what kind of properties are inside of that application. For here, for example, you see there's an image. Here's product header, Dachzeile H1. So this one here. And the cool thing about it is the developers could now working on their React apps all the time, which later gets integrated in AEM, but they didn't have to deploy to AEM all the time. So people without a running locally instance can now work as a fully integrated team member doing that. And also you can change here the properties on the fly. So you can just change it here in the UI, and then it changes automatically in the application. Basically as the same as when a content author changes properties in an AEM dialog, right? So on the next slide, there's a very simple component, which is part of this library I also told you about. This is just a block quote component when you could use it as a referral. When you want to include client quotes on your page. This kind of component was reused in all products and all landing pages, and also in that single page service applications I showed you. So very basic, but this will follow us through the rest of the talk. Here on this page, you already saw what React properties are. So that's basically the properties of a component. So the data you inject inside of that component. And the concept we were using here throughout the whole architecture is that React component properties are kind of equal to dialog properties. So when this is the React application's properties, so you have the image URL again, the author, text, background color, and stuff like that. So everything you saw on the application. This is basically the same as the keys from the content node inside of the Java content repository. And what you see here on the right is that it extends to a general interface, which is which every component does that. And what that means is here inside of that interface there are other stuff, other properties included, like if you're an author or publish, some global data like service times, and maybe also analytics data. Now I just want to show you quickly how it looks like from the perspective of a React developer when they're using that library. So this is basically the whole implementation of the component you already saw. So in the upper area you see the provider, because I already said we're in the context of different brands. We need that provider to inject a theme, and the theme is basically just a string which indicates which kind of brand you are. You could inject it as a string here, you could use it as a variable from the window, and it could be, for example, dependent on the page property of an AEM page, but it could also depend on the path where you are in the JCR, right? So if you have company A / content / whatever, then you would show company A theme here. And this is a reference to the block quote component, which is a module of that front-end library. And there are all these properties injected. So very simple, basic, but that's everything they had to do. In general, what I showed you right now is just very raw overview, what the React implementation is all about, but we go more in detail about that later. But at first, let's look at the AEM generator, or earlier we called it Dialogs generator. And let's see what that does and how it helps developers to work in AEM without knowing anything about it. So it's a module. It's open source in NPM. There's one part open source of it, but not everything. It's based on TypeScript. It's used in the build process only. You could use it also while deploying. Maven could execute it, for example. But the way we decided to use it in that project is the developer decides when to use it and when he not wants to use it. It generates all needed AEM sources for a new component. And like I said, it's open source. And whenever we are in a new client context and there are specific requirements, we're extending that module to the specific needs of the company. If you want to have it and want to look at it, it's available at NPM. Also, there's a simple demo project with one simple React component which is using the generator. Feel free to do any pull requests here if you want to work on that as well, or if you have any questions in general about that, feel free to ask us at the playground session after the talk, or just write us an email, and we're happy to help. This is how it looks like from a very high-level perspective. So beside your React component, you just create a dialog.ts file. So dialog.ts indicates for the dialog generator, or like now it's called AEM Generator, this is a file I need to look at. And when you hit npm run build dialogs, so just a simple npm command, the generator will check the full repository for all dialog files, reads the configuration out of it, and then creates all these files here on the sides. So it will create your full folder structure, it will create the HTML template, all dialog files needed, and even though it's also creating the analytics configuration depending if you want to have it or not. Let's check that out for an example. We use the same component. This is the dialog for the block road component you already saw. It contains of 2 text fields. There we have a text area, and this is a file upload, right? And please notice here, there's an additional link. It's called image editor. So this is a custom dialog fields which is also working inside of that generator. So what do you need to do to use that tool and to create a component like that? So from the perspective of a developer, beside his React implementation, so we use everything with TypeScript, because then we can use leverage interfaces, and you have validation inside your IDE, right? So if you miss any key, or instead of a string you put in here an array, there would be an error directly to see for everybody. So let's go through the keys. So it's an AEM Touch UI dialog. This is an import which is coming from Node module, from the tool. And then you have the component path. And the React developer doesn't even need to know how the structure in the AEM repository looks like, because we're just referencing here a variable which sits, for example, in a common TS file or a common JavaScript component or something like that. So this is here basically the path in the JCR, and you're just extending the path with your new component name. You could name it like whenever you want it. But in our project, we say when it ends with React, we just know that's a React component instead of a normal HTML component. Then you have your name, the component group, also to don't do any typos. This also from the common TS. Description is optional. Build config for AEM is just a Boolean value to indicate if you want to just create your dialog or if it should build everything for you. React app name is something special here for that project. And then the important one here is tabs. Tabs is basically an array of objects. You have your title there for your tab, right? So you have your quote component. And then it has, again, an array which has dialog fields. And to make it a little bit more readable, we mostly put that in a different variable, but you just could also put in one object if you want to. And this is basically the configuration for that. So again, import from our module. And then you have a label, is required description key. This is a JCR key, as well as a key in the React properties, which I already showed you. And this type here, this is super helpful, because now when a developer doesn't, for example, he wants to create a text field, then he just types touch UI field dot, and then everything is exposed. You can also see that here. So the React developer would just use our tool, create an object, label it, type, and then there are all available types here. There are even more types available depending on the client we are working with, because, like I said, we're extending that all the time. But this is how they work now. And they use it also for 50 or 60 components already, and everywhere we introduce it, everybody loves it somehow. And this is what happens when you hit npm run build. So all these files here on the left are created. So we have all folders and XML files, dialog with functions. What does that mean? Because we're not deploying a simple, we are not creating just a simple XML file, we're just working with TypeScript, right? So you could also, when this is in, for example, imagine it's a drop-down field where you have all your brand colors, you could just reference the brand colors from an NPM module like they did, or you could run a function on that to dynamically create any values. Or what they also did is they used the array.filter API to sometimes filter out any values from a dropdown they didn't want to have, which is kind of handy sometimes. Yeah, it creates analytics if you want to, HTML template, SSR again. So this is this bundle here. Alex will tell you later about that. And one super important thing to say about that is it's super easy to migrate to different repositories, or when there's, for example, imagine a resource type is changing for 60 or whatever dialogues. You would just change it one time in the generator at npm run build and you're done. Or for example, if you want to change the resource path of your apps, then you just go back to your common TS where I showed there was a reference of the path in the AEM. Just change that, run that build, and you're good to go. Whenever we introduce that tool to new clients or projects or developers, we have the same question very often. So these are the most common ones. I just want to have the chance to already answer them. So to make everything clear, can we use component inheritance? That's possible. We just use a resource super type inside the generator, which is an optional field. Custom dialogs can easily be implemented and referenced. How this should be done is written in the NPM documentations, but I will show you some example how we did that here as well. It's not mandatory for every component, so you could use it for some components. For some components you don't use it. You could also just init, for example, your new Sightly application, your Sightly component, just init it once, and then afterwards you don't use the generator anymore. It's also possible. And the supported types are listed in the enum, right? So you saw that here already. Where was it? Here. You saw that already. Yeah, if there's missing anything you would like to have in the open source version, just do a pull request or write us an email. We're happy to help. So what is the concept about the decoupled React components and why do we use it? The HTML template is basically the same for every component. There's no need to fetch data async in the client because we're injecting the data while doing server-side rendering. And the application itself is also rendered on the server as well. So we have 100% full SEO support because in that context, even the navigation was created with React. And it's just a criteria you need to have, criteria. In that case, we also had separate JavaScript builds. You could also integrate everything in a normal client lib in AEM, is also not a problem. We just decided to do that because the server-side rendering component, I will show you later, will check dynamically which component is used on the site and then just loads the specific files needed. And one important thing we had to do also is the components can, with this architecture, be used outside of AEM because the company had multiple content management systems. This was one criteria we wanted to serve. And there's no problem at all that you mix HTML components with React components. So you don't have to decide, hey, now I need to do everything in React. Not at all. You can just do it for some components if you want to, or for one team. And the other team could work with Sightly components, so no problem there. When you look at the page, it looks basically like that. So the content author puts or injects multiple apps here, right? Everything is a React app, could be also Sightly apps here. And then we have the magic SSR component. It just checks, hey, author, what are you using here? It knows which kind of component there are, and then it injects all the scripts and all the CSS, and it also injects the data server side from the dialog into the React application. But what happens on the client? So like I said, the templates, the Cyclic template is basically the same for every component. It looks super simple, and that's one goal we always have. So we want to don't overcomplicate anything, we just make it more simple, especially for new developers who are onboarded from the client. We want to make it simple for them to just go and work. So here you see a reference to the server-side rendering component. In detail, Alex can tell you something more about that. So we reference the SSR, and it's used here and on some other parts, but this is a simplified example. But we're talking about the client, right? So what does a React loader? This is a TypeScript class which is running on the bottom of the page. And what it does is it looks for an indicator. Hey, please give me all React components on that page. And this is the AEM React component CSS class. So it says document get elements by class name, and then this class here. So it gets a list of elements now, and it iterates over it, and then just checks what is the second CSS class. And this class indicates what kind of component it is. So again, get all React apps, run, iterate through it, check which component it is, and then use the data params here to inject the data directly without any async fetch into the React app. And that here, the highlighted part is basically a JSON string. So if you would look at it, it will look like that. So again, here you have your author, job, text, and some other properties I told you about. So this is edit mode true, service time, stuff like that. And even though here there's an object which is basically the style system, so we're using the normal AEM style system to do the padding and the background color for every component. This is included in the provider. So whenever we develop a new component, it's already working with the style system, and the author can select it should be red background color and the very big padding, for example. When you look at the component itself, so in the React implementation, it will look like that. You saw the parts on the left side already. So there's a connection between the data. So remember the React loader, the TypeScript class, runs through every element, checks the React class, and then injects your data from the data params directly inside of that. And the result of that is that small React AEM component. So what about custom dialogues? What is that? Why do we do that? What's handy about that? What maybe not? So we needed that for very complex authoring use cases. I will show you some example on the next slides. We also wanted for some components provide a better UX for the content authors, because some years ago, the content authors of that company had basically the saying about what should be done on AEM. So it was not the business department, the content authors owned that platform. Let's look at one example. This is kind of complex product table. It's also what was built inside of that brand repository, so the NPM module. And it goes far more down, but you see some examples here. So you have icons everywhere, here and here. You have different kind of cells there. There are tooltips. When you look at the structure, here are 3 products. Here's a field where you have then 2 fields again. And also on the bottom below, there are multiple different CTA fields. And before we did the custom integration there, they had the concept that you had one wrapper component for the table. So then there you have a complex parsers element. So it's basically a grid, like the table grid. And for every grid you had to put in, or for every cell you had to put in a different AEM component, which was basically a cell. And the PDF, the documentation about how to use that component was, I think, like 8 pages long. This is when you click on edit of that component and you click on edit this with our application, then this pops up. So this is basically also a React app. This is the author React app. And here you could just change the width of the cell. You could drag everything around. When you click on the icon, for example, an icon picker shows up. I can show you that icon picker also on a different slide. Yeah, that was just a concept we tried out, and the content people liked it there. If you have only 3 tables or like 5 tables on your whole website, this is not a problem at all. But they provide with that AEM instance 100 of websites, different brands, and a lot of product tables to compare different products and services. So another custom dialog is the thing I already mentioned. So here's an image editor link. They wanted to have a feature, so remember this is 2 years old, where when you edit a component and you have a component, for example, on desktop, tablet, and mobile, the viewport always changes. Sometimes also it's, remember on desktop it's 16:9 image, and on mobile it's 1:1, for example. And the content authors wanted to crop and change different rendition settings based on the viewport. So we provided also that with an integration. So you drag and drop your image here from the side. You click on image editor. This one opens up. Then you could toggle the tabs for the devices. You could also add more devices if you want to. So if you have way more breakpoints. And then here you could select if you want to crop or if you want to use a rendition. Image format, and then just crop whenever you want. And below here there's a preview of that. The icon picker is the most loved one, I think. Remember, they had multiple brands and a lot of icons. So it was basically 3 times of that. And previously they had here a drop-down in the dialog, and the drop-down was about, what is it then, hundreds of items long. And you needed to remember, for example, what's the name of that icon and why is it not that icon? And this was basically a long list. And when you now click on the drop-down, this thing here pops up. You just select the icon you want to, just click 1 click. And then you're good to go, and the content author is able to select icons way quicker. And remember, 100 of websites, and on every single page, mostly every component had icons in it. So let's talk about what we learned, and then I will also show you a kind small preview of what we're working right now on, which I'm super stoked about because I think it's really fun to do that. So what are the pros and cons we did here? We had the right range of potential team members now, because maybe it sounds a little drastic, but they really needed to know anything about AEM at all. They just knew, if I run the dialog generator, it creates everything which is needed for deploying a new component, and that's basically it. So the hiring process for the company was super easy now. At first they had only some special AEM forces there, and now basically everybody was developing components. The acceptance was super good afterwards, because the developers could just use the tooling they already know and the tooling they loved, so they were just developing everything in the storybook as well as in React, and the productivity increased dramatically because happy developers just work better than frustrated ones. So onboarding was super fast now. Also the acceptance for the dialog generator inside of that company was super great, because it was not like, here we provide the solution, deal with it. It was more like the people understood how everything worked, and they did pull requests. They said, hey, what about that feature? What about that feature? Hey, in that use case, we need to add another dialog field. So they did the pull request on their own. We just reviewed that, and so they're now developing their own custom implementation of that. Custom dialogs and complex parser structure, you have to think about that, because like creating an own application just for putting content in an AEM component is a good overhead, but depending on the use case, it might be worth it. SEO and React works, so this is a no-brainer anymore. And the good thing here in that use case, components can be used outside of AEM. Maybe not too useful for everybody, but for this company it was. The cons. Remember, we provided that boilerplate, right? So there was a lean project, every tooling was inside it. So team members, or different teams, which weren't AEM developers before, they just could easily create new AEM bundles, and yeah, so there was a mess there. So we had a lot of bundles and packages, and whenever there was, for example, dependency upgrade from the, for example, the brand library, we had to release like 8 or 12 AEM repositories, which was painful somehow in that organization, and we shrinked it down to 2 or 3 again afterwards. So that's something I didn't like too much. And an important thing here, because you have now access to just hit npm run, npm install for different front-end dependencies in your project, there were some problems when, for example, one developer installed a dependency which was installed in the common file, right, in the small, very TypeScript file, which was used everywhere. And then we had JavaScript builds around 20 megabytes on that page, so that wasn't too good. We noticed that before going production, fixed that, and then we included a tool which checks the bundle sizes all the time, so this can't happen anymore. But you need to be aware of that. So what are we working on right now? One problem we had before, we couldn't use parsers or AEM core components inside of a React component. That is fixed now, so that's working. That's super fun to work with, because you are now also able to nest different React components inside of each other, but like I said before, also plain AEM components, and you can now reuse normal plain image components inside of that apps. Components as a service is a new architecture we're doing for 3 clients now, and what that means is you can develop new AEM components without deploying AEM at all. So we have like 30 or 40 components, and we don't need to deploy AEM once. So once when we start the project, but afterwards it's just a service where all components are registered and everything happens on its own. If you want to know more about that, we can also discuss that later maybe in the playground session. Just real quick, how does it work with the parsers inside a React component? So we have the custom parsers component here. This is basically the name of the parsers in the JCR. So every child components are under that path now. And let's look. I have to change the monitor real quick. To show you a live example. So now the screen should be synced again. So this is a plain AEM instance without anything on it, just our React implementation with a new architecture. Just do a reload real quick. So this is the component. We can inject my text here, and also maybe an image. Then you will see the properties here. And here you see the state. So the state is running, right? So it's not breaking the React application when you mess around with the structure with the parsers. And then I can also put in my title and can just plainly do inline editing inside of that component. And like you see here above, it's a geometrics sample site. You can, without any problems, also use normal sightly components. So you can mix up everything if you want to. And the structure for that is basically that here. So normal state. This was a timer you saw. So this here just to indicate that the component is not breaking. You have the parser reference here, and that's it. And the components you see here will be deployed to AEM without any AEM deployment. So there's one service which is hosted in AWS, and that's all. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. If you're a little bit shy, come to the playground session. If you're even shyer, scan that thing, write me a WhatsApp or an email. Please don't call me at night. But otherwise, thank you for your, thank you for being here.